You may have heard your grandma, your mom, or even your older brother say a stitching time saves 9, and here that's very true. This demonstration would be very relevant for someone who wishes to create a garment or another sewn article. It needs a stitch to join the pieces of the article together. Say you have a dress that needs to be sewn in a very difficult area that's harder to get to with the sewing machine. That's where your back stitch comes in. Or say you had a broken seam in that dress after it had been finished, and you can't get to a sewing machine right now, and all you have is your sewing kit. That's also where the back stitch comes in. I believe that I'm fairly qualified to instruct you all on such a topic. I have roughly 8 years of experience in the sewing and textiles world. I have also given lessons to a class of 6th graders, and I've also had a few private students of my own. So I'm going to go over the materials that you'll need to do this job, and then we'll get into the process. So to start off, you will need your scissors, preferably fabric scissors. Those usually work best when you're working with fabric. Your thread. Here I'm using Gutermann 100% all-purpose polyester. Your hand sewing needles, which are fairly small. Most of the time they come in packs of 100 or so. Your garment to be mended, or the thing with your broken seam. Your pins, preferably in an adorable little tomato pin cushion. A pencil to mark your seam allowances, and then a ruler or a protractor or something that you can measure your inches or centimeters or whatever seam allowance you're working with, whether it be imperial or metric. So for your new seam allowance, your new creation, you'll start off by lining up your pieces so that the edges are even. And then once I reorient the camera, you'll see a little bit better what I am describing. So here we have your new seam piece. So you'll line up your edges nice and even. You'll take your ruler, and here I'm going to use a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So right there it's at the 1/2 inch mark. So it's halfway from the end of the ruler and 1 inch. So you'll just make a little mark every so often down the edge. And then once you've made your marks, you'll line up the straight edge of your ruler with the marks you've just made and connect them. Trying your best to keep it nice and even. And it's alright if it goes just slightly off. After all, this is just an example. No need to be too stingent with examples. And then once you have your seam allowance marked, you'll go through with your adorable little tomato pin cushion of pins and pin it in the opposite direction of the way you're stitching. So the points of your needles will be facing away from your hand. So be in the same direction that you'll be putting the needle down into the fabric and then pulling it out and forward. And as you're pinning, you want to make sure that your edges are staying even, keeping it flat and smooth, and lining up any markings that you have. Now that we have that pinned, we can set that aside for a moment and get our needle threaded. So usually you want to work with roughly an arm's length of thread. So that's holding the spool at your shoulder, gripping the tail of your thread between your fingers, and then just pulling outward until you get the amount of thread that reaches from the dent in your shoulder at your chest to the ends of your fingertips. And since we're doing a back stitch, we'll want to thread the needle double, which means you thread the needle with a double strand of thread, so that there's 2 strands of thread coming off the end of the needle. And when you're working double strand, you want to make sure that the ends of your thread are even, and that when you're tying it, they stay even. So to create a knot, you take your thread and then you just kind of twirl it over, pushing the upper part over and then under. Pull those 2 tails through the loop. Then you'll pull on the needle end of the thread to tighten your knot. And you want to repeat that, stacking your knots over each other until you have 3 or 4 knots stacked up. It's usually a good number to keep things held in place. Once you have that done, you can begin stitching. So to begin stitching with a knotted back stitch, you come between the layers up through your stitching line, however deep from the edge that your stitches are going to be on your marking line for your seam allowance. And then you'll just pull your needle through your fabric, then bringing it over the edge to the side, you'll come back up through that same spot, but instead of going through between the layers, you'll go around the back so that your needle pierces both layers. And you'll pull your needle through, making sure that the loop that you just created over the edge stays nice and neat in line with your seam allowance. And then to begin the actual back stitching portion, you would come forward and down on your seam allowance so that your needle penetrates through your seam allowance line, and then instead of pulling it through all the way to the back, you'll turn your needle and come up through your seam allowance line again. So when you're making your first stitch, it should look something like this, with your needle piercing each layer of fabric twice. So the beginning of your stitch and the end of your stitch. So you'll come through and draw your needle through, and then you'll go back down through the hole that you entered through, creating the back portion of the stitch. Repeating that same in, over, and through motion as before. And when you are stitching a back stitch, make sure that you tension your stitch, which you can do just by giving your thread a little gentle pull. On a little bit heavier fabric like this, you don't want to pull too tight, or it can cause odd movement in the fabric. So you'll just keep stitching, keep stitching, keep stitching, until eventually you have your completed seam. which for the sake of time, we will not be stitching the entire seam today. Just enough for you guys to get the point. So on the top, it'll look a little bit like machine stitching, like what you'd see in a commercially created piece of clothing or a bag. And then on the back, it has these looping stitches almost, where it comes forward, goes back, and then goes back forward again, creating the back movement of the stitch. Hence the name back stitch. So we'll just clip off our thread from our new seam example and move over to our broken seam example. So, like I mentioned before, say you had a broken seam on your dress where you just popped a couple threads and it just needed to be stitched up real quick, just so that the integrity of the dress would hold until you could fix it properly with a sewing machine. When you're working with a machine sewn seam, like this is here, which I sewed on my machine earlier today, you want to come in from underneath just a little bit away from the part of the broken part of the seam, which I've marked here in blue. Nice blue pen. And instead of stitching forward, you do the back portion of the stitch first. And you back stitch around the machine sewn threads to hold those in place. So you just follow the old line of stitching to replace what was damaged. And when you're working with a machine sewn seam, you have to pay attention to what type of thread was used to sew the seam. If it's a cotton fabric, like a cotton summer dress, you'd want to use a cotton thread or lighter weight polyester thread, like what I'm using here. And when it comes to fastening off a seam, which I didn't cover on the last example, you'll end it much like how you started on the machine sewn example. So you'll go down and through so that the needle exits through the back. And make sure you tighten it, and then you'll form a loop against your fabric, perhaps, and then you'll bring your needle around and through, holding that loop down onto the fabric. So then you'll put your finger over where the thread comes up through the fabric, very gently, and then pull on the needle end of the thread until you can feel the knot stop moving. And then you'll just keep making loops around your stalk until you have 3 to 4, much like how you started, to hold your thread tail in place. And most people like to bury their thread off into the seam allowance just to get it out of the way and keep it hidden. Just clip it off, makes them close to hide it off. So when you're choosing needles and thread for projects like these, you want to use a needle that would be conducive for your fabric. So a little bit heavier cotton like this would need a thicker needle Whereas something like a softer cotton or synthetic, like something like this, would need a much lighter needle and a much lighter thread. So a good way to remember it is thicker fabrics, thicker needles, thicker thread. Thinner fabrics need a thinner thread and a thinner needle. Because you don't want to be pulling a thick needle through a soft, flowy fabric, because that can leave holes and it won't hold this seam as properly due to the size of the needle holes being left and the size of the thread that would be in that needle. So there we go. You have your seam tidied and clipped, ready to be finished off and meet the world. So to finish off a seam, at least in this example, you'd use something like pinking shears, which have these zigzag edges on them, which cut ribs into the edge of the fabric, much like you can see on the machine sewn example. Just these little bumps that keep the fabric from fraying out and let it hold a little bit smoother. So there we go. Off you go with your newly repaired or simply new thing. It definitely took a few more than 9 stitches, but hopefully it saved you all some time.